This is Unit 3, Lecture 1, covering the first part of Chapter 11. And we're going to be looking, of course, in this chapter at interest groups. And remember, interest groups simply are a group with a common interest that seeks to influence government. That can be anything from the National Association of Manufacturers to PETA to the Sierra Club to Greenpeace to, there are just numerous examples. And the dilemma, the constitutional dilemma that comes up when they were writing the document was essentially what Madison writes about in the Federalist Papers, that he wanted both liberty, yet at the same time he also wanted order. And these two values clash, because if you allow people the liberty to form groups and express their views, this destroys the hope for an orderly society, or at least it did in his view. So he realized that political factions were inevitable. Political factions would be political parties, but at the same time, they would also be different interest groups. I'm not sure that he ever thought that the interest groups would evolve the way they have in the modern era. But he says in the Constitution that the way it is written, there is a need and an effort to control their effects. And again, I'm sure he hasn't ever thought that it would get to the point that it has now. So we know that a political party is an interest group of people who are seeking office. A political interest group is a set of individuals that are organized to promote a shared political concern. Now, you'll notice that, perhaps you'll notice if you do some shopping, that the price of eggs went up at the beginning of 2015. One of the reasons for that was that I think voters in California in 2008 passed an initiative that was pushed by organizations like PETA to force farmers to give hens who lay eggs more room. It was, in essence, a need to promote free-range farming without looking at the economic cost. So one of the results of that is that voters voted in favor of the initiative, and now a number of egg producers are either moving out of state or are going out of business. And you might say, well, hens are living a better life. Sure they are. But PETA had no concern about the fact that in an era in which we're concerned about things like gas mileage and pollution and things like that, it was all about the hens. It was all about how we treat chickens. There was no concern about the bigger issue. And perhaps their concerns butted up against people who might have had sympathy with their position, but are also interested in seeing what happens when gas prices are lower, or if they're concerned about pollution, what happens when you've got to use all that trucking to ship supplies of eggs in from out of state, because you've basically made it untenable for egg producers to be economically viable in the state of California. And so that is the conundrum of interest groups. It's people who share a political concern, but that political concern in many cases exists in a vacuum. They're not concerned about anything else. Or if they are, their concerns are very peripheral. So political parties are distinguished from interest groups by the breadth of the focus. Political parties have to consider everything. And the parties have to build coalitions. And those coalitions many times clash within the umbrella of that political party. Look at the effect of immigration on the Republican Party, or the effect of Obamacare and what it's done, the support of Obamacare, what it's done to the Democratic Party in the 4 years that it's been passed. So the parties build coalitions by addressing a wide range of issues, but interest groups focus on a narrow set of issues of immediate concern to their membership. So Policy generalists are the political parties. Policy specialists are the interest group. Now the types of politics are in essence represented by this slide right here. You've got the party politics, the building of coalitions, the broad look at issues, many issues, many times that parties have to consider. Whereas, and so therefore the efforts of the party itself is sometimes spread thin. Whereas with group politics, there are many organizations organized around very specific issues, but those groups have kind of an advantage because they can put forth all of their effort and all of their money and all their demands on that single issue, which in essence makes them more powerful when it comes to dealing with this issue. Now, we need to go again over the theories. Now, we have gone over these three theories before in our first unit, but again, we have to come back and look at them. So we're going to look at pluralist, elite, and class, and hyperpluralist. So we know that with pluralist theory, society's interests are most effectively represented through the efforts of all these groups. So in this marketplace of ideas and things, you have all these groups competing. And if their idea really is a good one, then they perhaps get themselves lifted above their competition. And by judiciously agreeing or not agreeing to certain things, they can get their issue passed. They're not going to get all of their wishes. They're just not. But what has happened is that single issue politics has blossomed. And where party politics is the building of coalitions and the balancing of needs, specific interests with the broader needs of society, single issue politics, or what we call group politics, is one which is organized around every conceivable policy issue. And each group therefore presses its demands and influences to the utmost. And they don't care, or if they do, they only care about what happens to the broader society in kind of an abstract sense. And so as long as they get their way, and as long as they get what their needs are, the rest of society can essentially go to hell because they got theirs. And that's not the way that we really want to look at America functioning in this day and age when we've got so many problems confronting us. Now remember, when single issue politics serves to increase the power of interest groups, and in particular interest groups that are only concerned about one issue, we have what's known as hyperpluralism. And then of course, elite and class interests can be entrenched in many interest groups, and that's the kind of if we look at all three of them, that's probably the one that's most nebulous. Now, when we look at these things in a deeper mode, we'll notice a couple things. We know that politics is always a game, and we see that, and it's a game of competition, and we see that now with people lining up for the election of 2016, and these interest groups beginning to jockey, looking at which of the candidates could benefit their interests perhaps the most. And within this big arena, each of the groups under the pluralist theory banner presses for the policies that it prefers. And you have many of these groups, let's say you take issue A, you have many of these groups coming together, and they represent centers of power, and they're very diverse and they're very competitive. But what happens is that no one group dominates. And they know they're going to win on some issues. They know they're going to lose on some issues. And so the interest groups, in essence, provide that key link between people and government, just like media does and just like the political parties do. The interest groups, therefore, are a linkage institution between the people and their government. Um, Now, again, no group becomes too dominant. And what we see is that all these groups play by a set of rules. They're not written down. So it's not like this is how you play poker, this is how you play canasta, or whatever. But they do follow rules. And what happens is that with all these competing things, there are groups that can't be weak. But I had you watch that video from the Annenberg uh, organization. And you remember the woman who had a son. She was in school and she was trying to figure out how she was going to feed herself and her son and pay for school and all the other things. And she joined a group. Well, that group was poor. And so they had to figure out what are the resources can they access if they don't have money. And so they used political protest. They used confrontation. Um, they and groups all across the spectrum do this all the time. Many groups like AARP, which are very well funded, don't have to rely on perhaps the vitality of their membership because they're able to afford a very effective lobby organization in Washington. But groups like that, Women's, don't have those kind of advantages. So they have to rely on themselves. And so groups do this all the time. Wherever they find that they have a shortfall, they'll find an alternative which gets their message across. And see, here's the thing. Lobbying is open to all. Every one of us can go out and lobby our congressman, our senator, the president, though theoretically that's pretty much a stretch, our local government. We do this all the time on an enormous number of issues. So there are people right now who are concerned that there's too many solar farms in the west end of the valley. There are groups who push for more low-income housing. There are groups who push for, just name the issue, and there's a group that's for it. So that's pluralism. Now, elite and class theory is a little bit different. This is where you sometimes hear about these conspiracy theorists, and they're talking about those super shadowy organizations who all want to link up with the United Nations and deprive us of our liberty and all of that. But sometimes I don't think it's as complex as that. Now we know that elite and class theory is divided along what would be historically throughout Western civilization, class lines. And that means that the upper class elite, the ones with all the resources, have more influence. And despite the fact that numerically these people are a smaller group, because of their resources, which buys them a pretty good piece of access, means that they wield much more power that is much greater than their numbers. That wealth, that influence, that access is where power is wielded. And the largest corporations, along with leaders in the political leaders, political families, the Clintons, the Bushes, the Kennedys, these are the types of entities that have the most power. And now let's look at this last one. It says power is strengthened by a system of interlocking directorates of these corporations and other institutions. And you might go, what did that mean? Well, let's take a look and see what happens after 2000. Hillary Clinton in 2001 is talking about becoming a senator from New York. She's setting herself up to run for the Senate, but she's no longer First Lady. And a number of corporations, let's say General Motors, GM, says we would like you to sit on the board. And they also offer the former president, perhaps, a place which he won't take because as a former president, it doesn't look good that you engage in corporate pursuits. But presidents will provide a place for themselves by forming their own, in a sense, their own interest groups, their own foundations, and things like that. So they play their own game. But Hillary Clinton, by being invited to maybe sit on the board of GM, Home Depot, Hospital Association of America, she's sitting with people who are like her, wealthy, influential. And when these people, as they sit on these boards, board of directors for corporations, they may sit on a number of boards, and they're going to make decisions that help the company of the board that they're sitting on. But the bigger picture is they're looking at this big picture, and they're thinking, well, we did this for GM, and we did this for Home Depot. We'll do this here, and they do become, in a way, interlocking. And then, like I said, with President Clinton, he may not sit on a board, or President Bush may not sit on the board of a company, but certainly they sit on the boards of universities and so on and so forth, and they can influence how those institutions operate. Now, the corporate elites seem to have one thing that perhaps sometimes interest groups miss out on. They don't lose track of where they want to go. They're sometimes very willing to lose a battle in order to win the war. And so they work to win major policy issues in their favor. They'll let you have your little victories here and there, but they never lose sight of that goal of where they want to be. And lobbying under the elite and class theory precepts is a problem, because only the people at the top benefit. And many times it comes at the expense of the vast majority of Americans. We're the ones that can't afford to buy a lobbyist or pay for a lobbyist. We're the ones that can't afford to, or we join a organization which is not that has not been that successful in developing an economic base. So therefore, they can't afford to pay for the best and most effective lobbyists. And so, money buys talent, and you have to admit that it's kind of a true statement across the board in a capitalist society. I don't have a problem with that, but it sometimes leaves many people at a disadvantage. Now, with hyperpluralism, it's the flip side of pluralism. Lots of groups, they're strong, but they're so strong that government itself is weakened because government can't act. It can't make a decision because no one wants to compromise. Pluralism is about compromise. Hyperpluralism is about no compromise. And one of the things that keep the government from working properly is this thing called an iron triangle. In your book, they call them also sub-governments. I first learned about these as iron triangles. So an iron triangle, and we'll hit it again in a later lecture, is, let's say, the Sierra Club, which is your interest group. Your government entity, your government peg, is the Department of the Interior. And that's the executive branch. Your legislative branch would be perhaps one of the environmental committees in either the House or the Senate, or the Interior Committee in the Senate. And these interest groups will put pressure on the executive branch people and the legislative branch people in order to get their issue not only heard, but resolved. And again, they're working in a vacuum. They don't care about the broader issue. They just want what they're interested in to win. And so interest groups have, in many cases, become so powerful. And they win a lot of times because they only have to win on their issue. Government has to, though, attempt to serve every issue. And when they can't do that because everybody, or a panoply of organizations, are standing in their way who want government to act differently, government winds up doing little or nothing. And so these sub-governments, or these iron triangles, really aggravate the process of governing. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time here with them. We're going to look at them in a greater detail later on, and we'll see a couple videos on iron triangles. So when the government attempts to please all groups, policies become confusing, they become contradictory. Perhaps Obamacare is an example of that, or the Affordable Care Act, which is anything but. And as you stand back, and we Americans look at this, we get frustrated because we see the government not responding hardly at all. But we don't realize that there are so many pressures put on it by interest groups that the one hand many times doesn't know what the other hand is doing. So the executive branch, the legislative branch can work at loggerheads, or the House versus the Senate can work at loggerheads with two different goals, and then nothing ever gets done. And we can see that with the Keystone Pipeline. Politics frustrated many of us Americans who were in favor of it, especially when gas prices were $4.25 a gallon. And environmental groups, business groups, energy companies were all involved in trying to influence President Obama to either sign or not sign this bill if it was ever to get on his desk. His Department of Justice, his Interior Department have all said this is probably a bill that should be passed. But now that the president has lost his majority in both houses of Congress, they will pass a Keystone Pipeline bill, and now he will veto it. He's getting pressure from some of his most loyal supporters, environmental groups, to veto this bill, despite the fact that, on a broader sense, most Americans would benefit from this. But here he's trying to please the environmental groups. And that's how it works on so many issues. Now, one of the things that we'll be looking at is these sub-governments, these iron triangles, may be not as strong as they used to be because there are so many interest groups involved. It's like you hear the noise because you've got all these people talking or giving you position papers or all of that. And after a while, you just kind of tune them all out. And so therefore, these sub-governments may not be as effective as they used to be. Now, to wrap up this part here that we've been looking at, the interest group system is kind of interesting. There's no country on this planet that has what we call a principle of association than the United States. It's been evident, it's been in our culture, our American political culture, since our founding. And when Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a Frenchman, visited the United States in the early 1830s, and he wrote a book called Democracy in America, one of the things he talked about was the propensity of Americans to join groups. If it wasn't barn raising, it was a sewing society. It was something that was very much the antithesis of how European culture operated. And I think one of the things that we have to recognize is this principle of association is accompanied by a division of interests. We have separate economic, ethnic, religious, social, and geographical interests here in the United States, much more so than any other nation. And because of federalism and the separation of powers, there's numerous political institutions at all levels of government which give interest groups and individuals access in order to lobby for their cause. And so the reason I put organization up at the top and in the smallest ball isn't because it's the smallest number of words. It's because an interest group, if they're unable to organize effectively, will either be unsuccessful and eventually disband, or because they are able to organize effectively, they are able to provide some success on their issues. And the more successful you are, usually the more people want to join you, and they bring money and influence and power and things like that. And so this is kind of the building blocks for the for the interest group system. Now, we might ask ourselves, as we wrap this lecture up, why do interest groups get such poor press? You know, there are as many people who bash and hate PETA as love them, or the Sierra Club, or any other group. And the fact of the matter is, you know, Madison, like I said earlier, disliked organized groups. Their experience with the parties in Parliament in England and the fact that those parties, the Tories and the Whigs, ignored them, made the founders look very askew at these organized groups. Yet at the same time, they knew that they would occur. It's the natural propensity, but especially of Americans, to join groups. Then when we get to the 19th century, the lobbyist game became very notorious. And when you look at especially the period from the Civil War to the turn of the century, the year 1900, the dishonest efforts by so many lobbyists gives the lobby game a very bad reputation. And then if we look at in the very broadest of terms, the term lobbying in general has a negative connotation, because, and the reason for that is that we look at lobbyists and we ask ourselves, are they telling the truth? Well, essentially, believe it or not, they are, because if they lied, then they wouldn't be effective anymore. What they're doing, though, is presenting you with truthful information, and then they're putting their own spin on it so that you buy the argument. That doesn't make them bad people. But what's happened is, over the last 200 years, lobbying itself has become a negative rather than a positive. So that's our look at this first lecture. And our second lecture will look at the reasons that interest groups have grown. Our third will be the types of groups that exist. And then we'll look at some of the things like incentives, the art of lobbying itself, and PACs, and the PACs and tactics. So that's the end of this lecture. I'll have it uploaded, and I'll get lecture 2 started.